So in the reading I gave you guys a pretty similar line of thought, or seemingly similar line of thought from Descartes and Zhuangzi. You have Descartes arguing that, well, you never know you're not dreaming, and, he uses this to start a line of thought, some really powerful worries, some doubts about whether we know anything. Zhuangzi seems to have a pretty similar idea, this idea he dreamed he was a butterfly, had no idea he was a person, equally sure he's a person when he wakes up. How do you know which is accurate, right? Um, I'll come back to his. I mean, I signed it because I do think it's interesting to see people going in the same direction so far removed in, time and space. But he and Descartes are using their thoughts here, these thoughts about not knowing whether we're dreaming or not in rather different ways. And for the time being, I want to focus on Descartes. His argument, what the argument is, and how it's supposed to work. But before I do that, I want to say in this lecture, just a sort of intro, to say a bit about what Descartes is doing and why, what his larger goals are. Because I think it's easy, and people often do, to read like Descartes, oh, I don't know if I'm dreaming or not, so I have to doubt everything. This can seem kind of silly. This can seem like just sort of, the kind of worry that stoners like to indulge in, right? It's like, oh man, how do I know I'm not dreaming, that anything's real? Why does Descartes do this? Why does he think it's important, right? He's not just trying to play some game to mess with your head. Oh man, isn't this deep? He has a purpose for engaging in these doubts. And you guys might be saying, oh my goodness, Descartes, just going over the top, I'm going to try to doubt everything. And Descartes knows he's going over the top. What Descartes is doing is a kind of test. He wants to take any supposed knowledge claims, any claims he has to know anything, and just basically put them through just this brutal, destructive test and see if they stand up to it, right? You guys have seen like product testing or whatever, where they'll put a blowtorch to something to see if it catches fire, right? Or they'll smash a car into a brick wall to see if people inside are okay. Or, it's kind of doing some research for this, like the coolest one. They'll take building materials, kind of make fake buildings, and they have these big things, and they'll like shake them like crazy to see if, this design of these materials will hold up to an 8 or 9 earthquake, right? Descartes is trying to do something similar with claims to know. He wants to subject them to this stress, this really, over the top test, and see if they survive, right? Think of what people do with cars or building materials or buildings or airplanes or any of this stuff. You subject them to way worse stresses than you think they'll encounter in the real world. If they can endure them, they can take storms or earthquakes or fires in the real world and be fine, right? I can't help but quote one more. I remember reading somewhere there was a test where they would shoot frozen chickens into jet engines to simulate like birds hitting the planes. Who thought that up? I don't know. I mean, I think it's great. I mean, right? Shoot a frozen chicken out of a cannon into the plane's engine. If it takes that, yeah, it can probably take a pigeon, right? But anyway, Descartes is doing something similar. Descartes says, well, look, I know these doubts are rougher than things in the real world, but if supposed knowledge can stand up to this, well, we know it's good. We know it's pretty durable. Why does Descartes want to do this? Why does he want to subject our claims to know to this kind of stress, this kind of test, right? And you'll notice, Descartes, in the piece I had you guys read, is just super worried about being deceived. Senses have deceived me once, maybe I should never trust them, right? So why in the world is Descartes, why does he think it's really necessary to do this, test of knowledge, and why is he so worried about being deceived? Well, I think a lot of this has to do with just the sort of intellectual upheavals and sort of revolutions of Descartes' time. Or the time a little bit before it, right? But it was still very recent memory when Descartes lived and wrote, right? Descartes wrote this in 1641. Well, the century before this, you had the Protestant Reformation, right? For basically, about 1,000 years, Europe had been, the Catholic Church was this unified authority. People agreed. You had this tradition people referred to. Um, you know, you had these acknowledged authorities who people would defer to, the Pope, the hierarchy in the church. The church had its tradition of thinkers and saints, people who you'd appeal to, people who everybody agreed, these are the people you look to in making your claims and settling them, right? Well, once the Protestant Reformation came on hand, Luther did not think very highly of this tradition in a lot of ways. This shared authority, this shared framework people had just kind of goes out the window, right? People can't agree what authority to rely on anymore. The authorities that one religious group looks to, another just completely dismisses, right? Another thing that happened, equally if not more important for somebody like Descartes, was Copernicus and the heliocentric theory. Now, it's sort of an urban myth that people forever, before Columbus or whatever, thought the Earth was flat. Actually, the Greeks had a pretty good idea way back in ancient Greece, 2,500 years ago or so. They had a pretty good idea that the Earth was round, right? There's a lot of different things that kind of clued them in. Probably the simplest one, is basically you can do this here, right? If you watch a ship sail away, it'll get smaller and smaller for a little bit, and then it just drops out of sight. The Greeks were smart enough to realize if the Earth was flat, the ship would just keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. It wouldn't just drop out of sight suddenly at one point, So people knew the Earth was round, right? What people did not know was that the Earth orbits the sun. For years, very smart people, the consensus in astronomy was the Earth is literally the center of the universe. Everything revolves around the Earth. The sun revolves around the Earth. The moon does. All the other planets revolve around the Earth, right? As you can guess, since they in fact don't, this had some problems, things in the sky moved in ways they shouldn't. So people kept coming up with what they called epicycles. Basically that the planets they moved in circles, but there were little circles that they would do mini circles on their routes, right? Anyway, this got super complicated, and Copernicus came up with this theory, well, everything orbits the sun. Hey, look, you can get a much simpler model without all the stuff you guys have built in. At first, people resisted. Then they came to accept this was also about 100 years before Descartes lived, right? I mean, literally, it's kind of turning everything upside down, right? For all of human history, people who've thought about this have thought the Earth was the center of the universe. It turns out it's not. I won't get into this because it gets complicated and I'm not as up on the story as I should be myself, but there were larger changes in science. Basically, the whole scientific framework that people had worked with literally since Aristotle, more than 1,700 years before Descartes lived, Aristotle came up with this model of what science was that had been pretty much agreed on. It was being torn down and replaced. So I think it is impossible, or at least it's very hard for us to imagine the way that things had just been completely rethought in Descartes' time, right? If you pick up a science textbook from 1920, a lot of things are going to be wrong, but you're not going to see everything in there is wrong, right? It's going to talk about atoms, it's going to talk about particles. If it's a book on astronomy, it's going to talk about, galaxies and all that. In Descartes' time, that wasn't true, right? If you were to pick up a book from 100 years ago, if you're Descartes, everything in it pretty much is wrong. Well, this is really unsettling, right? You're Descartes, and you say, well, look, for the one thing, you have this reformation, suddenly people don't agree on who the authorities are. One group is really sure they're right, the other group's sure they're right. Well, these are all a lot of smart people. If they can radically disagree, how do you settle that? Even more worryingly for Descartes, you can see him being really concerned about this here. Think about all these years people were wrong about basic facts of the universe. And you're Descartes and you say, well, if smart people can be so badly mistaken for so long, what assures us that we're not mistaken, right? How can we avoid being mistaken and deluded in the way that these people were for so very, very long? Descartes wants to avoid that. And he thinks, that if we start with these hardcore doubts and we use them to just tear down anything that doesn't survive these doubts, we'll get a method that allows us not to rely on any authority. We don't have to take anybody else's word for it. We can just see what's true ourselves. And he also thinks this method will allow us to achieve absolute certainty. We can achieve certainty and we can avoid this sort of error and mistakes that you see in the past, and we can be sure we're avoiding it, right? So that's what he's trying to do. Just tear down anything that might lead one to be mistaken or that relies on some sort of authority. Just clear all that away, start over, get something better. Now, here's the thing. I only assigned you the first one of Descartes' meditations. There are several more because I think the important stuff, or a lot of the important stuff, happens in the first one. Well, why do I say this? Almost everyone agrees that Descartes fails in his larger aims. He does not, give us a method or give us knowledge claims that actually survive the kinds of doubts he raises. What he does in the next meditation, ultimately the way he solves this is he'll say, well, yeah, we have all these doubts, but, God exists and God isn't a deceiver. And Descartes actually has an argument for God's existence. It's a form of the ontological argument. Descartes tries to argue that God exists out of sort of logical necessity in the same way, that triangles have three sides out of logical necessity. It's what they are. God by necessity exists, Descartes will say. I'm not going to get in the ontological argument. There's some debate about whether any version of it works, but pretty much everybody agrees Descartes' version is not good. It's a really bad version of this argument that might not work in any form. What Descartes does really well, though, is to motivate these skeptical worries, these worries that we might not know anything. He doesn't really do so well in giving us a method that will solve the worries he raises. But the worries themselves, he does an excellent job of raising, right? He doesn't give us a solution to his problem, or at least not one that seems to work. But he raises a doozy of a problem. So anyway, I just wanted to be fair to Descartes. I'm going to give Descartes a very hard time as we go on. But Descartes was a brilliant person. You know, people kind of pick on Descartes. It's become fashionable to say, you know, just, oh, Descartes made these mistakes, whatever. And I think he did. I think there is a mistake here that's interesting to look at. But Descartes was brilliant. I mean, he was the guy who came up basically reducing geometry to algebra. Descartes was the one who did that, right? If you take classes in, like, say, analytic geometry or linear algebra, you have Descartes to thank. Some of you might be, oh, yeah, well, now I hate him, right? But anyway, he was brilliant, made these huge contributions to math. He was also a badass. Apparently, he was a great sword fighter. There's a story that he fought off 3 armed men just on his own. Actually also wrote a book on sword fighting that was lost that people said was really great because he was apparently really good at this, right? Anyway, put all that aside, I'm going to give Descartes a very hard time in the future lectures, but I do want you to realize he's a great intellectual figure. I'm not just picking on him. I think he goes wrong, but when brilliant people go wrong, there is usually something to be learned from it. All right. So what is it I want to focus on here? Well, as we look at Descartes' worries, I want to ask what it is that knowledge is. What can we learn about what knowledge is and what knowledge requires? And also, can we learn something about the mistakes people make in making claims about knowledge in looking at Descartes? I actually think we can. I actually think, looking at Descartes and what he's trying to do here might give us actually some insight into the mistakes that conspiracy theorists and people like that make. I'm not saying Descartes was a conspiracy theorist. I mean, he certainly wasn't. And conspiracy theories in the time he lived were an even bigger thing than they are now. But I think there might be a similar mistake at work in what Descartes is arguing for here, in his skeptical worries, in his doubts, and the sorts of things conspiracy theorists say. So, I want to get to that. I think that'll be interesting. Those are the 2 things that I think I want to look at Descartes, sort of wrestle with his work to try to get these out of it.